Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. My name is David Downing.
And I'm Crystal Downing. We are the new co-directors here at the Marion E. Wade Center.
And we're excited to bring you our new podcast.
The Wade Center's podcast will feature interviews and discussions with scholars and figures related to the Wade's 7 authors.
C.S. Lewis, j.r.r. Tolkien, Dorothy L. Sayers, George MacDonald, G.K. Chesterton, Owen Barfield, and Charles Williams.
Our guest this week is Douglas Gresham.
Doug is the stepson of C.S. Lewis, one of the most prominent authors here at the Wade Center.
Doug is the son of Joy Davidman, an American writer who married Lewis later in life and influenced his novel, Till We Have Faces, as well as his study on the nature of love, The Four Loves.
We had an opportunity earlier this fall to sit down with Doug to discuss his relationship with C.S. Lewis, Lewis's relationship with Joy, and their deaths, as well as his memories of other Wade authors like j.r.r. Tolkien and Dorothy L. Sayers. We will feature excerpts from our interview with Doug over the course of our next 3 podcasts, so make sure to come back to catch parts 2 and 3 of our interview with Doug.
For this first episode, we were able to discuss some difficult topics related to love and the loss of Doug's mother and C.S. Lewis, including some memories of the day he found out about Lewis's death.
Also, make sure you stick around until the end of the podcast to catch Doug's story about the fascinating imposter, Mrs. Lewis, as well as some comments by him on the next film in the Chronicles of Narnia series, The Silver Chair.
Make sure to connect with our podcast and subscribe on our website, wheaton.edu/Wade, as well as iTunes, Spotify, and even on our YouTube channel.
This week, you will hear questions from Crystal and me, along with Marjorie Mead, the Associate Director here at the Wade Center, and Aaron Hill, the Editorial Assistant and Production Editor for 7.
We hope you enjoy this week's episode.
I was listening to your reminiscences. You're talking about your mother's beautiful piano playing and her sight reading and her ability to memorize scores. Did Jack ever get involved with music with her? Would they ever?
No, I mean Jack.
Together?
The best thing they ever did together in that sense was Jack would start singing some ribald song or other, and Mother would just automatically start putting in a bit of a feathery pattern on the piano. But no, I mean music wasn't the huge thing in our family that it could have been. I think probably because no one really had any time for it anymore. Mother was busy dying, and Jack was busy working, and they tried to combine the two, which they did very well as it happens. But I mean, Jack and Mother, they did have some good times as well. I mean, you've probably read A Grief Observed, which I think is one of the most valuable books about grief ever to be written. It points out something that people still don't pick up from it, I don't think, or not enough anyway. And that is that when someone we love dearly dies and we grieve for them, we should value our grief, because it's the only way we can measure how much we love that person who's gone on ahead of us. Grief is valuable. We mustn't wallow in it. We mustn't take advantage of it and inflict it on other people. But we must value it unto ourselves and to God, because it's the only way we know just how much we really, really did love that person who went on. There's no other way of measuring it. And I learned that when my mother died, that the only way I suddenly realized, I mean, I walked out of the kilns after the funeral. It was a beautiful sunny day in the summer. And I walked across from the gate and through where the kilns themselves were, which there aren't anymore. There was a big weeping willow tree there. And I leant on the fence looking up toward the lake, and I started to cry. I just couldn't help it. I'd been holding it in for hours, just started to cry. And suddenly this massive arm laid gently across my shoulders. And this voice said, "Don't cry, son, it'll be all right." And it was Fred Paxford, our gardener, who was a really good friend of mine. I looked round at him and he was crying. He learnt, as I did, that the tears are valuable. The grief is valuable. I don't know how we got onto that, but anyway, it's just
since we're talking about that, I think you said in your reminiscences that the British in general are not huggers and embracers.
Well, they never have been. I think it's starting to change now, but probably in the wrong directions.
Well, you mentioned that one of the few times that you remember Jack embracing you was right after.
Yeah, it happened a couple of times, but the one that was significant, I mean, he might just put his arm on my shoulder and something, but the one that was significant was when I came back from Lapley Grange School, just after Mother had died, and to come back for the funeral. And I walked into the front door of the kilns, and Mr. Cross, his driver, immediately drove away, leaving me to be with my stepfather. They didn't want to interrupt and didn't want to interfere. Very nice people. And as I walked into the house, I opened the door of the common room, as we called it. And there was Jack, and he was standing with his left arm on the mantelpiece. And I'd seen him only a week before, but he looked to me to have aged 20 years in that week. He had grown smaller, and his hair had turned white. And I just couldn't help it. I burst into floods of tears at the sight of him. And he rushed across and put his arms around me and held on to me. And we both cried together for quite a long time. And then finally I said, well, what are we going to do now, Jack? Jack said, we just carry on, I suppose. And that's exactly what we did, and we've been doing it ever since. At least I have. Jack's gone on to be with Mother and Jesus now, but I've been carrying on ever since. What else is there to do?
Well, it's always so lovely having you here. And
Thank you.
You've come for lots of different reasons, just visits, as well as times you've talked
Indeed.
and so on. But you're here for something a little unusual this trip.
Yes.
And I wondered if you'd like to share a little bit about what you're here and why.
Well, the reason I'm here is because a young man in Malta, whom I got to know through a variety of different and rather difficult circumstances on his part, he was going through a difficult time. And we became friends. I helped him in every way I could. And he actually had read a piece in an article in a magazine about myself and my wife and what we were doing at Rathfinton Ministries, and that we were running a Christian psychotherapy and counseling ministry there. And so he got interested from my descriptions of the work we did, and he is now a professor of clinical psychology. But his hobby has always been making films, and he's very good at it. He's a meticulous director and producer. So in his spare time, he makes movies. And he decided, after he got to know me pretty well, we've become the best of friends. I mean, he's a really great guy, and his wife's a lovely person too. And he decided that there was a story in my life that should be told, and it should be told honestly, with nothing hidden, nothing concealed. My own villainies will come out in this documentary, as much as will the better things I've done. So he came to me and he said that he would like to do this. What did I feel about it? And I said, well, you have to give me a few days to think about that, whether I've got the courage and so forth and the energy and what have you. And so he wrote me a short synopsis of what he thought it ought to be like. And I read it through and I talked with Mary about it and I prayed about it. And after about 3 or 4 days, I said, come and see us. And he came out to our place. And we said, we think we ought to do this. And that's why I'm here, as you know, to go through some of the history of my being at the Wade Center and why, and to start more and more filming of who I am today and how I got to be who I am today and why I got to be who I am today and who I'd been before. I mean, I was hell-bent for hell for a long time. And it wasn't until I came into the realization that I'm not qualified to run a human life, and nor is anybody else on this earth, except Jesus Christ. So Robert, I think, is probably making this film because he's got a story himself he wants to tell. He's a really nice guy, and his wife's a nice person too. And he's a very creative director and producer, as you'll see as we work.
I have a working title for you, A Gresham Observed. Will that work for the documentary?
Everybody would hear that as a Gresham preserved.
Oh, that's right.
Observed.
To say it carefully.
I think we'll leave that one out.
Yeah, that goes on the editing floor. Any other last thoughts?
I was wondering if the gentleman with the earphones on would like to ask him.
I actually, I'm Aaron.
I apologize.
So I've read a number of articles, and there was maybe it was a Christianity Today article, and they were discussing the anniversary of Jack's death, and you were sharing your story about hearing the news, and then about everything happening on that with the same time as the Kennedy assassination. And I was just wondering if maybe you could just share a little bit about the events or how that happened, related to everything was going on with the news. You were talking about seeing the reports of the Kennedy assassination. Would you be willing to share any of that? I know
Sure.
that's an ask to you.
Well, I can tell you how I found out in the first place that Jack had died. I had no idea that he was that sick to start with. I knew that he was ill. I'd been a short while earlier. I'd been to hospital to visit him. And he had been in a coma and come out of that, and described the fact that he had been disappointed to have to come back. And that struck me as interesting until I thought about it and worked on it. But I was actually at school in Surrey, a school which no longer exists, though it was a very good one, called Applegarth. It was a grim day, a dark, sort of rainy, sort of cold day. And during the afternoon, we heard that President Kennedy had been assassinated. And my reaction to that was kind of strange. I felt that this was a great tragedy, but at the same time, an incredible news story. The whole world would have to listen to that and think about it. And then I went to do what we call prep, which was outside study. You go down to classrooms at the end of a long path and so forth, and out in little sheds sort of places. And I forget what I was working on. And I heard the sound, unusual in a boys' school, of high heels running down the paved pathway. I instantly knew that those high heels were coming for me. And it was the headmaster's older daughter, Pam, who suddenly came into the classroom and said, Doug, can you please put your books away and come with me? And I thought that something not good is going on. So she led me all the way back to the path to the house, and the headmaster's wife met me there and put her arms around me and said, look, I'm terribly sorry, but your stepfather has just died. For a moment to me at that point, it seemed that the earth had stopped rotating. Everything had come to a stop. Everything was finished. I had no one to turn to then at all. Once again, I was completely alone. When I first heard that my mother was dying of cancer when she was in hospital, Jack took my brother and myself to hospital to see her. All we knew was that she'd broken her leg, because that's all we'd been told. And he took us into a little side room and did for him what must have been incredibly difficult, because he'd been through the same thing as a child himself. He said, look, I'm sorry, but your mother hasn't just broken her leg. She's been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and she's not expected to live more than a few days. Now, he was going to stay and visit with my mother and just be with her. My brother ran away. He was told he had to show me the way home to the kilns, because we'd only just moved there. After mother broke her leg and was diagnosed with cancer, we had no longer anywhere to live except with Jack. And I started to find my way home. I was 10 years old at that time. And I found myself walking down a cinder path which leads into the churchyard of Holy Trinity Church, Headington Quarry in Oxford. And I lifted the latch on the wrought iron gate, pushed it open, and stepped out of this world. As simple as that. I was suddenly in an entirely different situation, different kind of life, different kind of everything. Every leaf on every tree was glowing with a kind of inner light, and all the grass was brilliantly alive. The place was absolutely full of a life power that I had never imagined could exist. And I remember this is long before I ever turned to Christ. And he said into my mind, though not through my ears, if you really can't make it without your mother, I can fix it. All you have to do is ask. And at 10 years old, I went to the church, and I knelt at the altar, and I begged with every fiber of my being that my mother be allowed to live for at least a time, because I really didn't think I could exist without her. I knew nobody. I didn't know Jack and Warnie at that stage. I had no friends. I really didn't think I could cut the chase without something drastic happening. So then this voice said to me in my mind, okay, fixed. Go home, be at peace, but don't tell anybody. And I knew my mother was going to be all right. So I walked on down the path, out of the church, turned left this time, walked on down the path to the second wrought iron gate, which led out of the churchyard, and stepped back into this shadowy, half-real world in which we live. It happened again 4 years later when I was 14 years old and was sent back from school because my mother was said to be dying. And I went to visit her, and she looked horrible. She looked terrible. She was just falling apart physically. And Jack was distraught, and Warnie was distraught. And again, I walked. This time I knew my way. I was 14 years old. Walked back through the same churchyard. And again, I stepped out of this world into a different existence, it's almost impossible to describe. I've done my best. And he was there again, and he said, if you really still can't make it without your mother, I can fix it again. But I had the overwhelming feeling that I could make it now. I was 14, I had Jack and Warnie, I had a family around me of sorts, people who loved me, people who cared for me. And I was much more able to take care of myself as well by that stage. So I thought it would be dishonest, and also somehow kind of grasping to ask for the same miracle twice. All I could think of to say, it sounds kind of corny now, but was, Lord, thy will be done. Walked down to the other gate, stepped out back into this shoddy world that we live in. And the lights went out behind me. And my mother died 3 days later. Mrs. Cross greeted me and told me the story. And then she led me into the house, took me into the headmaster's sitting room and sat me down and went and poured me a large whiskey. I was, I suppose, 16, 17 at that stage and not really legally old enough to drink. But she said, you might need a little bit of something to pick you up a bit. And Jilly came in. Jilly was the one who I was really very, very fond of and still am, though I haven't seen her, as I say, for decades. And she said, is there anything I can do to help? And I said, well, you might do one thing for me, Jill, if you wouldn't mind. She said, what's that? I said, would you go up to my dormitory, where I shared a room with about 5 other guys or 4 other guys, and tell them what's happened so they don't ask too many awkward questions? Because in my experience, when somebody asks you what's happened and your mother's just died or your father's just died, you crack up, and I don't want to do that. So she says, of course. So she disappeared and she went up there and told them what had happened. Anyway, I stayed with them for about 2 hours, I suppose, getting quite late at night by the time I finally realized I should go to bed, try to get some sleep at least. And there was a guy in our dormitory called Johnny Peters. Johnny was a South African kid, and he and I fought like tooth and nail. We were just always fighting about the way apartheid was being run in Africa against what ought to be done and so on. And despite that, we were also very good friends, if you can understand it. We got into tussles occasionally, but we were good friends. When I got back up the dormitory and lifted up my pillow to get my pajamas out from under it, there was a half a bottle of brandy sitting on my pajamas. Johnny had gone out of the window, climbed down the drain pipe, run all the way down to the town with all the money he could get from the kids in the dorm. None of us had much. Bought this half bottle of brandy and brought it back up to try to give me something that would see me through the night. And in fact, I was already half blasted on the headmaster's scotch. So I said, guys, you're going to have to help me drink this. So we all got fairly well inebriated that night. But it was a loving gesture from a guy with whom I fought most of the time. And I was very fond of him deep down, but of course he was a rogue.
Your anecdote, isn't there a teaching, if someone asks for a drink, give them 2 drinks? Was that the biblical principle? Maybe I'm misquoting or misremembering.
There's something that came up in an email I wrote yesterday, as a matter of fact, about someone asking me about revenge and sort of fighting back against things and so on. And it was about, I quoted the piece where Jesus says, if someone strike you on the left cheek, turn to him the right cheek also. And to me, that means something rather special, having been a boxer. If someone hits you on the right cheek, he's done it left-handed. Most people are, in fact, right-handed. So if someone hits you on the left cheek, you'll give him the right one to belt it with his right hand and get the job done properly. Now, that's the kind of forgiveness I think we have to learn. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Speaking of this period, in your reminiscences, you mentioned that Christopher Tolkien appeared out of nowhere and said, "Is there anything I can do to help? Please let me know." Well, did you have much relationship with Christopher?
No, not. I don't think it was Christopher I ran into. It was Professor Tolkien. It was Tolles himself. I came out from the hospital. There's a funny story attached to this if you'd like to hear it, but I'll tell you. Jack was in a sort of almost a comatose state, but not quite. But he came out of that coma and recovered. And I went to visit him. And we chatted about nothing in particular. And finally, Jack said, "Doug, hadn't you be better getting down to the station? Hadn't you better be getting down to the railway station?" And I said, "Jack, what for?" He said, "Oh, to collect the au pair girl." You know what an au pair girl is? Yeah. And I thought, well, what au pair girl? And Jack said, "Oh, didn't Mrs. Miller tell you?" I said, "No." She said, "Well, we've got an au pair girl coming from Paris to come and live in the house and help Mrs. Miller look after the place and take care of things." Now, I was at this stage, 18 years old. And I'm thinking, French au pair girl, come on, this is cool. So I said, "Well, I suppose I'd better get a taxi then." And he said, "Yes, indeed." And I said, "Okay, but I don't have any money." Jack said, "Well, I don't have any either. See if you can get some from the matron of the hospital." So I went and got the matron, got her to lend me some money to pay the taxi. This point, I went back to Jack and I said, "I borrowed some money from the matron of the hospital to get the taxi." And Jack said, "What taxi?" I said, "Oh, the taxi to go down to the railway station and pick up the au pair girl." And Jack said, "What au pair girl?" I said, "Jack, 10 minutes ago, you told me I had to organize myself to get a taxi to go to this station and pick up an au pair girl who's coming to the kilns to help Mrs. Miller in the kitchens and stuff." He said, "Doug, I'm terribly sorry. That must have been a complete hallucination. I don't have any recollection of that at all, and no such thing is happening." So I said, "Oh, okay." By this time, the taxi woman had arrived, and I had to go and pay her to go away. She was a fairly concrete individual. And Jack apologized profusely for this. And in some mystification and more worry than ever, I walked out into the street and Tollers was coming the other way. And he said, "You won't remember me. I'm Professor Tolkien." I said, "Of course I remember you." And he said, "Well, if anything should happen to Jack and you have nowhere to live, come and live with us." And I thought, well, this is a wonderful gesture from a man who barely knows me. And as a friend of my stepfather's, of course. So I said, well, as it happens, I do have a place to go should anything happen to Jack, which I think is unlikely. But and that is my mother's best friend, who's a motoring journalist, has offered me a place at her home. And so I thanked him very much and was very touched by his offer. And off he went to visit Jack, and I went off in my directions. And I've thought often since then, years later, of course, that if it had happened to happen, that I was responsible not only for Jack's copyright stuff, but also for Tolkien's, I probably would have been in a lunatic asylum by now.
That story of Professor Tolkien is even more touching when you realize, as a young man, he was orphaned.
Yes.
And he was taken in by
that I didn't
a
know at the
Catholic
time.
priest.
I didn't know at the time.
And so it's very clear he remembered with gratitude.
Absolutely.
And also what it felt like to be all alone.
Yeah.
And to need someone. So I'm sure that was a very genuine,
I'm
very
sure it was
loving
too.
offer.
And I was deeply moved by it and still am.
Yes. Doug, we've talked about a lot of things over the years, but I'm not sure we've talked about this. Lewis is well known for his capacity for friendship. That's very obvious. When Shadowlands first came out, a lot of people interpreted it as depicting Lewis as being in an ivory tower and unaware of things. Well, his friendship with Paxford and Clifford Morris, the taxi driver, and so on. But there's another interesting episode, difficult one in some ways, and amusing, I suppose, in some. But Nell Burner's Price, you know what I'm talking about. There was a woman who had been going around from hotel to hotel and had called herself to she would say, "Oh, I'm Mrs. C.S. Lewis. My husband will pay the bill," and so on. And I got to know Nell. I know you knew her when over the years, but she had been one of those hotel owners who had
Indeed.
a bill unpaid, and so she was a very gracious, lovely lady herself. But she had come to the kilns, I think, to collect, maybe by mail. I don't remember the specifics.
No, I think she wrote to Jack first
and asked, will you
what's going
pay
on?
this bill? Yeah.
we need the money.
And that's when it all sort of came out. But out of this, he was, for all that he did not want any connection appropriately with this woman who clearly was either, I don't know if she was mentally ill or just using
criminal.
it. Yes. Yeah. Either way.
She had a long history, it turned out.
But your stepfather, Jack, asked Nell, would you go visit her in the prison?
He also was in the court.
Yeah.
Jack doesn't talk about this much, but he was in the court when the trial went down.
Yes.
And he said the one thing that he found most horrible about the whole experience was this woman was in the dock like a hunted animal.
Yeah.
And he was horrified by the whole scenario.
Yes.
And deeply saddened by the fact that he had to be there and the fact that it had to be him who was, in a way, condemning her.
Yes.
And it left him I think self-disgust would be a reasonable way of looking at it. But there was nothing he could have done about that. It wasn't his fault.
Right.
But it really hurt him that he had been, in a sense, indirectly responsible for a person being hunted like an animal.
Yes.
And that's what he said to me when he came back.
But what I think, what's interesting is Nell, who could have been, she was a lovely person.
She could have been vindictive, but she wasn't.
Yes,
yeah.
and he could have very much said, I don't want to even think about this anymore. It's painful. It's horrible. But yet he became friends.
Yes,
with
and
the
stayed that
Burners
way
Prices.
for life, and helped them out on many occasions.
And you and your brother went and stayed at their hotel and all of that. So it's just that capacity for friendship.
I think their daughter, their daughter was probably at the Westminster Abbey laying of the stone in Jack's honor.
Was she?
Where I was there to read a piece from the Magician's Nephew. But I had been so worked that particular month that I was barely conscious at the time. And I know everybody wanted me to go into the into sort of meet and greet afterwards. But the HarperCollins people who had me there just grabbed me and put me in a cab and took me back to my hotel because I was barely able to stand. It was one of those times when I'd been in a situation where I had to work nonstop for months. Mm-hmm. And I was just totally exhausted. I've always sort of felt sorry that I didn't go because there were people I would have loved to have talked to. But they said, no, look, you've done enough. You really haven't got the energy to do this. We've got to take you back and put you into your hotel. So and I'm very glad they did now. Looking back on it, I might have collapsed in the whole thing, you know. But yes, the interesting part, well, the sort of part that leans on the exceptional kind of man Jack was that he felt guilty about this woman being trapped like a hunted beast in the dock. And that really upset him. Yes.
And yet here's Nell Berners Price many years later, just loving that she'd gotten to know him, enjoying having kind things to say about your mother, for example, and you and your brother, and just being that he did not go through life quickly. He invested in people. And
that's very true. Very true. Invested in everybody who came across his path in a way. Yeah. Like the time when he was walking through Oxford, I think probably with Tollers. There were several people have claimed to have been the person. And a beggar approached him and asked him if he'd got any spare change. Jack immediately put his hands in his pockets and drew out all his spare change and poured into this guy's outstretched hands. And the guy ran off. And I think it must have been Tollers, because the sort of thing he would have said. Said to Jack, Jack, you really shouldn't have given that man all that money. He'll only spend it on drink. Jack said, well, if I'd kept it, I would have only spent it on drink. But he went without his pint of beer that day, so this other chap could have a pint of beer, or whatever.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
So Marge has asked you about friendships and Jack's capacity for friendships with humans, but one of the things that I appreciate about him, and my wife as well, and I've noticed in his writings and people have remarked about, especially the Chronicles of Narnia, is his relationship with animals. Mm-hmm. And so we have a photo here that I've seen of you and your brother and Jack and the family dog, and just very, fluffy dog. I was wondering if you could tell us maybe any stories or reminiscences you have about Jack and just his relationship with the animals that you guys had at the kilns, and anything related to that.
Well, it's very typical. I mean, Jack just liked dogs. End of story. And he treated them like anyone who really enjoys dogs and knows dogs well would do, like people to some extent, but not too far. He also liked horses. When they bought me a small horse, or not somewhere half between a horse and a pony, it was a cob, as we called it, he would often go out and talk to her. He did like animals, and he felt that animals probably got the rough end of the stick from human beings, and he thought probably to a certain extent from God too, because God gave us these beautiful creatures, but Jack felt that they should be able to understand us better than they do, and we should be able to understand them better than we do. I think in that sense he was probably right. And he's not blaming God for anything. It's just that God is obviously right in what he did. But I think he always felt, well, his reaction to the horse slaughter in the First World War was a mark of this. He felt that animals tended to get the wrong end of the worst of everything. And he was always sad when animals had to be put down or something, which occasionally happened. He understood animals probably in some ways better than most people do. Let's face it, if you read the Narnian books, the characterization of some of the animals, the bears and the badgers and people in those books are just amazing. Shows his real love of animals. Yeah.
When your mother died, did he talk to you about the death of his mother?
No, I'd known of that for a long time before. He and my mother had talked about it ages before, and my mother explained it all to me. And this is before she was ill even. So I did know that Jack had been through this. But I don't know if any of you ever heard or remember a song called Doug's Song, actually, that Meg Sutherland, Alice's elder sister, wrote and performed, indeed, on stage when we were here for that concert show with what's his name that I'm staying with? Come on. Jerry. I'm getting tired again, you can tell. The story of that is an interesting one, because I was coming back from somewhere in one of my cars, one of my sports cars, and I got to a place in the road where I had to slow down and stop because all the traffic was jammed up because there'd been a crash at the roundabout below. And I'm listening to this song, and it always makes me cry, because the song is about a little boy called Diggory, whose mother is dying of cancer. And he goes to Narnia, or the creation of Narnia, and he sees Narnia created by this wonderful character, Aslan, the great lion. And he knows, because of his evil wizard of an uncle who has just said, this is the world of life, this is the land of life. Everything here is living, everything is coming to life. And he suddenly gets the impression that his mother could be saved by something, by the fruit from a tree that grew in this land. So then Aslan sends him off to a garden in the middle of the world, Narnia, which is being created, where he finds, this is like the Garden of Eden, and he finds the apple tree, and he's told not to eat of the apple, but to bring it back to Aslan. And the White Witch, Jadis, has got there before him, and she tries to tempt him into eating the apple. He doesn't. He flies back on Fledge with Polly, and they come back to Aslan. And he says, look, can I go home now? Aslan says, no, throw the apple into the mud by the river. And Diggory gives up. You think that's the end. His mother's going to die, and he can't do anything to save her. But the apple then grows into a tree, which produces more apples, and he's allowed to take that back and save his mother's life. Jack, when he was about 9 years old, was faced with his mother dying from cancer, and he prayed and prayed and prayed that she might be allowed to live, and she died. That's one of the things that started to turn him away from his theoretical religion at that time. I, on the other hand, was given the same problem. I was walking back from the hospital through the churchyard, and I prayed and prayed and prayed, and went into the church because he told me to, and I prayed. And my mother lived. She went into remission. And then the next time I came back, of course, I was old enough to cope, and I realized it was the right thing to do, and I said, thy will be done. But when I hear that song, there are lines that just hit me like a ton of bricks. First of all, he looked at me. It's referring, as Diggory talking about, or the singer talking about Aslan. And the next one is, then he smiled at me. I go a bit further. The last one is, he cried with me. Mm. And I was sitting in this car listening to this song. Just the CD happened to be in the player. And I started to cry. Mm. And a policeman on a motorcycle, slowly drifting past, because traffic was all stopped for ages, got off his bike and he came back to me and said, are you all right, sir? Mm. I said, yes, why do you ask? He said, well, because you're crying. I said, well, hop in the car a moment and I'll tell you and explain why. I did and explained. I played the song to him, and he started to cry too. He was only a fairly young man too. It's just quite extraordinary. Mm. Why have I got onto that?
Death of mothers.
Deaths of mothers, yeah. Well, we all went through it. You know, this is the strangest thing. When you think about it, that Jack and I had such parallel childhoods, so many ways, and it took Jack quite a long time to come out of it, and I think it took me even longer. Jack was younger than I was when he turned to Christ. I was 45 when I finally made that decision.
I wanted to ask you a couple of Narnia questions. You mentioned Uncle Andrew. I was struck by the parallel with Robert Capron, the oldie at the school, which he suffered so much. The physical description in the letters, he says he's about 60, has a mop of gray hair. He says he has a pointed nose.
Uncle Andrew all over again.
Yeah, that's what I wondered. I wondered if
Uncle Andrew was evil. I don't think Capon was. I don't think he was evil. I think he was insane.
Right.
The two things are verging on each other. But I think Jack was probably using the character as Uncle Andrew quite blatantly.
Well, he said something in Surprised by Joy about turning the monster into a buffoon. You should always be kind to literary types because they may use you as an archetype and later on, and you'll be immortalized.
There are lots of characters in Jack's writings whom I recognize. I really do. I know some. As I say, he had this incredible skill of creating characters whose personalities existed in real life long before he ever met the personalities. Eustace was my brother, without a doubt, but he hadn't met him at that stage.
Mm-hmm. And where is the silver chair, or where are we in? Maybe you can't talk about it, but
well, I can't talk much about it. Just that we're working on a variety of different possibilities.
We have a gold chair, a bronze chair. You're gonna have to decide.
There's some, the whole industry, the whole film industry is changing so rapidly at the moment that it's hard to keep up with the changes. So we're working our way cautiously through a minefield. We will get it done eventually. And I think I think it's going to make a wonderful movie, mind you. I've got some ideas.
We're certainly looking forward to it.
Actually, to be honest with you, if I had my druthers, as they say in America on occasions, I would like to shoot this one in Tasmania.
Oh, wow.
Because nobody's done it yet. New Zealand's already on every screen. You look, some parts of just about every movie made in New Zealand. Tasmania, nobody's shot a main feature film in Tasmania yet. It can be done. You have to ship the stuff over, the equipment and so on. But Tasmania, I'll put it like this. New Zealand is kind of like Tasmania on steroids. Tasmania is an utterly beautiful place. It has a wide range of wildlife, not just birds like New Zealand has. It's unlikely that the ground will open up and swallow you, which it does quite regularly in New Zealand. You don't drive along mountain roads to see a sign that says slip and wonder what it means until you go around the corner and find the road has slipped off the mountain. Stuff like that. There's a lot of good reasons why Tasmania is a better place to film, I think. My Kiwi friends will probably slaughter me for saying so, but we did have a lot of fun filming in New Zealand.
Questions? I think we should let you go. You've been very generous with your time and your insight.
Well, I am starting to run out of voice.
So much. This has been delightful.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again.